Good afternoon. My name is Kyle Roberts, and I'm the Associate Director of the Library and Museum Programming at the American Philosophical Society. Welcome to the fourth day of the APS virtual conference, Responsibilities, Reciprocity, and Relationships, Indigenous Studies in the Archive and Beyond. I'm so glad that so many of you have been able to join us today. The American Philosophical Society resides in Lenape-Hoking, the homeland of the Lenape people, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. The APS acknowledges with respect their continued presence and perseverance, and expresses its sincere thanks for the past and ongoing generosity of numerous Indigenous communities and individuals who've offered their guidance, their expertise, and opportunities for collaboration. This week's conference is inspired by the important work of the APS's Center for Native American and Indigenous Research and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation-funded Native American Scholars Initiative program. For those joining us for the first time, the American Philosophical Society was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743. The Society is a catalyst for the discovery of new knowledge. Election to membership honors those who have made exceptionally significant contributions to science, the arts and humanities, and public life. The Society promotes research by providing $1 million in research grants a year, primarily to younger scholars who need the support the most. Our library and museum collections and research centers serve scholars and visitors from across the globe. Please check out our website, amphilsoc.org, to learn more about what we do and for news of forthcoming events. We are using Zoom webinar today, so not to worry. You have all been muted. You won't accidentally interrupt the conference. If you have a question, we ask that you use the Q&A button at the bottom center of your navigation bar. Maybe you can take a moment to locate it now. It's right down there. Ask a question at any point in time during the panel, whenever it pops into your head. We're going to leave 15 to 20 minutes at the end of the panel for your questions of our speakers. We're also excited to offer closed captioning for this conference. If you'd like to use it during the panel, please click on the CC box, also on the bottom navigation bar of Zoom. It's right to the right of the Q&A button. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Alan Corbiere, York University, who will be moderating panel 5, Community Based Archival Initiatives. Alan Corbiere, Ben Dunham Ruffed Grouse Clan is Anishinaabe from Chigang First Nation on Mandalay Island. He was educated on the reserve and then attended the University of Toronto for a Bachelor of Science. He then entered York University and earned his Master's of Environmental Studies. During his master's studies, he focused on Anishinaabe narrative and Anishinaabe language revitalization. For 5 years, he served as the executive director at the Ojibwe Cultural Foundation in Chigang, a position which also encompassed the roles of curator and historian. He also served as the Anishinaabe-Moan Revitalization Program Coordinator at Lakeview School, Chigang First Nation, where he and his coworkers developed a culturally based second language program that focused on using Anishinaabe stories to teach language. In September 2019, Alan successfully obtained his doctorate in history at York University. Congratulations, Alan. And he is now assistant professor in the history department at York. And it's my pleasure to now turn this panel over to Alan. Thanks for being with us today.
Am I live now? Nana bojo Anishinaabe dok nin sao jik benen dodem mechiging don jaba mampi nido menesing tek shkunagan nui manajak nui manajan anik gondak mishom sananik ode denapi a king mishom sanang dijnakanda nan. What I would like to say is we want to honor the people there called the Lenape, who as a Ojibwe Anishinaabe person, we would call them our grandfather. Even if this person, a Lenape person that I met was younger than me, I would call him Mishomis. So we say to the land of our grandfathers, the Mishom Sanang. We are, this is a good panel. I read the papers and it's going to be excited to hear their presentations. So I want to actually introduce each of the speakers now. The first will be Megan Baker, who is Choctaw. She is a research associate for the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma's Historic Preservation Department. She works in the Community Outreach Program, where she consults on special projects, writes articles in the tribal newspaper, organizes its virtual speaker series, and researches and develops educational material for Choctaw community members and the wider public. She is a PhD candidate in anthropology at UCLA and is working on a dissertation that examines the political and social consequences in the private property regime on Choctaw communities in Oklahoma. So welcome, Megan. Rose Miron is the director of the Darcy McNichol Center for American Indian and Indigenous Studies at the Newberry Library in Chicago. She holds a BA in history with a minor in Spanish and a PhD in American Studies from the University of Minnesota. Her research explores Indigenous interventions in public history within the Northeast and the Great Lakes regions, as well as American Indian nationalism and activism in the 20th century. She is currently working on a manuscript project tentatively titled Indigenous Archival Activism, Narrating Nationalism in the Mohegan Tribal Archive and Beyond. The project is based on 9 years of close collaboration with the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohegan Nation and explores how Native people use tribal archives to change the way Indigenous history is accessed and produced. Dr. Miron is the author of an article about repatriation and self-representation of material culture that was published in the Journal of Native American and Indigenous Studies in 2018. And her work has also been published by the North Dakota Quarterly and the National Council on Public History. Prior to joining the Newberry, she served as the program manager for the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition and continues to serve on their Research Advisory Council and contribute to their ongoing digital archive project. She has 2 forthcoming pieces co-written with Christine Dean-Dice McLeave about the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition Digital Archive Project. Next, we have Heather Bruegl, a member of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin and first-line descendant Stockbridge-Munsee. She is a graduate of Madonna University in Michigan, and I should say Madonna. We say Madonna, Ojibwe pronunciation. And holds a Bachelor of Arts and Masters of Arts in U.S. History. Inspired by a trip to Wounded Knee, South Dakota, a passion for Native American history was born. She has spoken for numerous groups, including the University of Michigan, College of the Menominee Nation, Shawanoe County Historical Society, the Kenosha Civil War Museum, again we would say Ginoje, Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohegans, and the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin. She has spoken at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh for the Indigenous Peoples Day 2017. Heather also opened up and spoke at the Women's March anniversary in Lansing, Michigan in January 2018. She also spoke at the first ever Indigenous Peoples March in Washington, D.C. in January of 2019. Summer 2019, she spoke at the Crazy Horse Memorial and Museum in Custer, South Dakota for their Talking Circle series. She has also become the accidental activist and speaks to different groups about intergenerational racism and trauma and helps to bring awareness to our environment, the fight for clean water, and other issues in Native community. A curiosity of her own heritage led her to Wisconsin, where she has researched the history of the Native American tribes in the area. While Heather calls Michigan home, she has recently moved to Wisconsin and is now the Director of Cultural Affairs for the Stockbridge-Munsee community. In addition to that, she also currently travels and speaks on Native American history, including policy and activism. So welcome to you, Heather. Lastly, but not least, we have Joseph P. Gahn, who is an international expert in the psychology and mental health of American Indians and other indigenous peoples. A professor at Harvard University, Dr. Gahn has collaborated with tribal communities for 25 years to critique conventional mental health services and harness traditional culture and spirituality for advancing indigenous well-being. He has published 85 scientific articles and chapters and received recognition in his fields through several fellowships and career awards, including a year-long residency at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. A graduate of Harvard College and the University of Illinois, Dr. Gon has also trained at Dartmouth College and McLean Hospital, Harvard Medical School. He is currently a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science and of 7 divisions of the American Psychological Association, an enrolled member of the Aaniiih-Gros Tribal Nation of Montana. He also served briefly as the Chief Administrative Officer for the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation. In 2014, he was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship. He is currently a fellow in the Interdisciplinary Research Leaders Program of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. So I guess you can join me in virtually welcoming this distinguished panel, and we are to start with Megan Baker, first of all.
Halito, Saho Chiplet, Megan Baker. Greetings from Caddo, Kickapoo, and Osage lands, which is now the Choctaw Reservation and home to the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, where we were moved beginning in 1831. Yakoki to the APS for having me today, and I'm so excited to learn from my fellow panelists. So to kind of begin. So I am trained as an ethnographer, and I was still developing a dissertation project that ended up using a lot of archival material. And I actually was lucky to be a Phillips Fund grant recipient to do some of the archival research that appears in today's presentation. So it's really great to kind of be able to share that. Next slide. So today I'm going to talk about, this presentation comes in 2 parts, and we're going to think about how do histories and archives kind of impact Choctaw Nation's assertions of sovereignty today. And then, which is kind of what mostly the paper goes into. So I don't delve too much about the paper. I'd rather talk a little bit more about part 2, in which we show how Choctaw Nation uses archival materials that are existing, that are across the country and the state, to develop a new kind of historical literacy about our sovereignty, in which we share with our people and kind of the wider community. Next slide. So in the paper, I'm really trying to think about how representations of Choctaw in Oklahoma histories, so that are written by non-Indian historians, how those kind of affect Choctaw, both Choctaw and non-Choctaw understandings of what sovereignty is, and how the history kind of played out, and the thinking about how those have had important political and legal ramifications today. And so there's a lot of misunderstanding about what actually happened in Choctaw history, or what is the actual history of the state of Oklahoma. And these are kind of concretized by the way that historians have written about it. And those histories then kind of get cited in very important legal cases that have affected like our contemporary gaming compacts, the McGirt decision, which I'm sure many of you have recently heard about. And so there's a lot of kind of misinformation and histories that I think that have to be kind of interrogated. And so in the paper, I'm really trying to think about how methods of knowledge production, and in this particular case, archival material, and how we interpret and write about them shapes the contemporary life of Indigenous nations and peoples today. If we take the most recent, if we take the McGirt case, for example, a lot of the state of Oklahoma's arguments was that reservations no longer existed. And if we kind of believed and read the historiography that they were drawing this from, we could see how the state could think this. But as part of the 5 tribes who we kind of always knew the reservations existed, and that's actually not really reflected very well in the scholarship that exists on the 5 tribes. So I'm trying to think about how history books and archival methods in particular affect our communities today. So next slide. So early scholars like Angie DeBow and Grant Foreman did a lot of really important seminal work that we build upon right now. But at the same time, like, I can't understate how important and amazing and how difficult the kind of historical work that they did is, but at the same time, it has its own kind of pitfalls. So their work was created under a particular methodological standard that doesn't kind of resonate in the same way today, right? They were very, they were both non-native scholars whose sources were official government records and writings by officials. It's the very kind of paper government records, things that they used. So given that, they don't have a lot of kind of Choctaw community perspectives of knowing how people felt about what was going on, all the kind of massive political kind of changes that were ongoing. And one really kind of novel thing about the Choctaw archival record is that there is an intense amount of it. I think it's pretty up there with the Hawaiians and the Cherokees, with having the most archival material written by the Choctaw people, the indigenous people themselves. Like, they are the ones who are writing and creating their records themselves, which is not, you can't say the same for a lot of other kinds of communities and how we're writing histories. And so, but at the same time, these are very kind of particular people who are creating these records, and I'm really trying to be very conscientious of this. These were, because we have our records in English and we have them in Choctaw, and it's really cool to kind of have those, but these are also people who thought a certain way about the world and knew how to interact with Europeans. But there's also a large subset of the Choctaw community who only spoke Choctaw or didn't kind of participate in tribal government in the same way, but they are still important people to kind of consider about when we're thinking and developing our Choctaw histories and as we're writing them. So I'm trying to also be kind of conscious of that and being really critical of the archival material we have and trying to figure out to tell the best history that is most representative of our diverse opinions and thoughts about what Choctaw history is. And so this is kind of what DeBow and Foreman were writing from. And could you, sorry, next slide. And so this is a critique that Donna Ackers, who's a Choctaw historian, she has really kind of made this really important critique. She talks about the need to use different kinds of sources to narrate history. So in her book, Living in the Land of Death, her book draws on Choctaw culture and language to contextualize the actions and decisions that our ancestors kind of made throughout the 19th century. And it's a really good kind of, it's drawing on different kinds of sources to tell this kinds of history, the kind of unconventional to historians sources, but now in Indigenous Studies is kind of the norm, is like that you would use language, that you would use oral histories and that kind of thing. And she also kind of critiques them, how they have a certain kind of perspective on who Choctaw people are. And that's also kind of important to consider when we reference those kinds of histories. So Ackers wrote her book in 2004, and really we have not kind of seen changes in the methodologies about Choctaw histories that have been written kind of today. And so there's a lot that is not discussed, not kind of gone through, that is really interesting that has yet to, we kind of have yet to see. And so knowing that the vast range of archival material kind of exists, and how thinking about how our office in historic preservation kind of engages community members, that they have so much knowledge that is not archived also, we know there's just a lot there. And this is not to say that scholarly publications are the only ways that we circulate knowledge, right? It's also, but it's, for me, I really want to emphasize how scholarly work does important things in the world, like Supreme Court cases and our contemporary kind of public history. 2 minutes left. Oh, wow. Okay. So let's just kind of, so there's kind of all of this and that we want to write back to. Next slide. So we have a historic prison kind of research group. And so these are kind of all of our members. And so our research group is are people who are interested in Choctaw histories and who like have gone through archives in their own kind of time. And so this is a group of people that historic preservation kind of works with to like write new kind of Choctaw histories or interrogate our sources differently. Next slide. And so what we kind of do is we work with archives, we go to different places and we look at the documents themselves, and we're kind of thinking about ways how we can learn from the archival material and tell our kind of histories from our perspective and all of that. And so we do that in different kinds of ways. Next slide. So we've had our language teachers and some historic preservation people, we've gone to like collections with massive Choctaw language documents. And so we visited and gone through the materials and looked at them. And so now we kind of have them photographed and archived within our stuff. So we're gonna try and create educational material and collaborate between different kinds of departments. Next slide. We also have our Choctaw Tisholi speaker series, in which this is a way developed out of quarantine to connect with scholars and community members and to share the kind of different knowledges that we have. And so that's a kind of ongoing thing that we have. And in this picture, we have 2 elders who gave a talk for us. Next slide. And this is just a kind of shows the different kinds of topics that we've had. So we had like stickball, histories. We talked to Donna Ackers, which was amazing. And next slide. And this one, next slide, sorry. Oh, backward. One more, sorry, could you go back to the slide? So one of the, one really great thing that we kind of did was we had one of our research people, her name is Sandra Riley. She grew up with stories about her mom, how they had to play about the Trail of Tears that they gave at the local kind of boarding school. Her mom had gone to Wheelock Academy, and so her mom had always kind of told her about that. And so we went to the Gilcrease Museum, and she went and found those kinds of records that talked about the play that her mom had always told her about. And so she got to like see learn about the play that her mom had always talked about and shared it with us. And so I love this story. And so if you go to our website, we published a little bit about it. And it just shows like how archival material in our communities, how we're trying to connect them. And then we like published it in our tribal newspaper, so people could kind of learn about that and see how archives can tell us about our past a little bit more. Sorry, that was sped through. 10 minutes went by super fast, but thank you so much, Yakoki.
Konamante. My name is Heather Bruegl, and I want to just thank the American Philosophical Society for hosting this conference, and also paying acknowledgement to the Lenni Lenape people whose homelands that Philadelphia resides on. I also want to take just a moment to let you know that I'm coming to you live from Wisconsin on the Stockbridge-Munsee Reservation, which was granted to us through the Treaty of 1856 that was once part of the Menominee ancestral homelands.
Thanks, Heather. And hi, everybody. I'm Rose Miron. I want to also just echo Heather in thanking the APS, and really glad that they've acknowledged, and we've continued to acknowledge throughout this conference, that the conference is being held on Lenape lands. I am the director of the Darcy McNichol Center for American Indian and Indigenous Studies at the Newberry Library in Chicago, but today I'm actually coming to you from Indianapolis, which lies within Miami ancestral homelands. So very excited to speak to you all today, and I'm going to pass it over to Heather to get started on our paper.
Yeah, so we're really excited to bring you this topic today. I'm currently the Director of Cultural Affairs for the Stockbridge-Munsee community, and so Rose approached me to do this paper, and I'm super excited that we could do it. So in the summer of 2019, the building that I'm standing in is our Arvid E. Miller Memorial Library and Museum. Hosted its first ever open house during our community powwow, which unfortunately we could not have this year due to COVID, but it was a really great weekend. And slide. It was the first time ever that the museum was able to secure objects on loan from various cultural institutions around the country that had meaning to the Stockbridge-Munsee community. We were able to bring in items from the Mission House Museum in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, and Stockbridge, Massachusetts has a important place in Mohican history. And another item that we were able to bring in was from the Oshkosh Public Museum here in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. And it was a powder horn that belonged to our sachem, John W. Quinney. He was a diplomat. He was a great leader of the Mohican people, literally right up until his death in 1855. Slide. Having Quinney's powder horn here in our museum was amazing. And it was even more amazing considering that we have descendants, direct descendants of him in our community, and they were able to come in and they were able to view this item that belonged to one of their ancestors, and it was huge. So after our loan was up with this item, I returned it to the Oshkosh Public Museum, having talked with our historic preservation program that we have here in the community, and we decided that we were going to try to repatriate this item as an item of cultural patrimony under NAGPRA, which is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. So when I took the item back to Oshkosh, I walked in and I said, our loan is over with this beautiful item, but I want to let you know that we plan to repatriate it. And their reaction was absolutely brilliant. And so we decided that we were going to repatriate it through cultural patrimony, which can kind of be difficult to do under NAGPRA, but it is something that can be done. NAGPRA defines it as an object having ongoing historical, traditional, or cultural importance centered to the Native American group or culture itself, rather than the property owned by one individual. And so we decided that this powder horn from Quinney fit that definition because he was a leader of the people. He was instrumental in our leaving our homelands in the Mahicanatuck River Valley and moving to Wisconsin. He worked among his people, not above his people. And because of his place in the community, it really just made sense that this item did fall under cultural patrimony. And while it was an heirloom item, we used a combination of archival materials and traditional knowledge that we have, because traditional knowledge is super important to show that the powder horn transcended basically from being just an object that belonged to him to being something that held meaning in the community. And as Lucienne Levine argues in one of her papers, that the powder horn had multi-layered meanings from its original 18th and 19th century economic, religious, and aesthetic functions to its 20th and 21st century use as a socio-political symbol.
So today we want to use this example of the forthcoming repatriation of John Quinney's powder horn and the role that archival documents played in that process to show how tribal archives both support Native self-determination and have the potential to advance reciprocal relationships between tribes and non-Native cultural institutions. And this is really evident when we look at the current processes around the repatriation of this object and access to materials in general. As we all know, tribal nations are working with more and more non-Native institutions to retrieve items or to gain access to archival materials. And in these processes, existing archival evidence has become a very important tool. It is used to communicate things like tribal affiliation, to highlight the importance of a particular item, and also to demonstrate how an item fits within the larger scope of tribal history. Slide, please. So in the case of the powder horn, the tribe used documents like John Quinney's speeches and his diaries to highlight his important role as a Mohican leader, which included the items that you're seeing on the screen right now, his 1852 speech to Congress and his rather famous speech that he gave on the 4th of July. Next slide, please. But, you know, they also decided to use other more contemporary materials. A powder horn can be viewed certainly as a very utilitarian item. And so to address this and to really show how the powder horn has transcended into this symbol for the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican community, the tribe also cited more recent 20th century materials like the papers of the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican Historical Committee to show how the community has continued to view as a leader, and thus also this powder horn as an important symbol of tribal leadership. So for example, on the screen right now, you can see Historical Committee co-founder Dorothy David's account of locating some of the Quinney papers in some of the efforts to locate Stockbridge-Munsee materials. The next image down is from a 1995 Historical Committee meeting that discusses the inclusion of, or the creation of, a Mohican reader, and talking about including John Quinney's speeches in that. And then the bottom image is of a conference that was held on the reservation in 2001. And there was somebody who was speaking about this speech in particular. So for many tribal nations, providing this kind of archival evidence can be an often difficult feat. Most of the archival records that are relevant to Indigenous history are scattered across various federal, state, and private archival collections, which, as most of us know, is a product of anthropological and historical practices that collected and removed human remains, objects, and information from Indigenous communities and sold or donated that material to various repositories across the United States. These repositories are often far from tribal nations, which makes gathering that relevant material incredibly expensive, time-consuming, and especially currently in the wake of COVID-19, often outright impossible. So for example, in this case, Quinney's diaries and speeches would have previously required that staff from the Stockbridge-Munsee Department of Cultural Affairs travel to the Wisconsin Historical Society in Madison or the Newberry Library in Chicago to gain access to these materials. And in many cases, even if tribal citizens are able to get to some of these repositories, locating the materials within the collections themselves can be incredibly difficult. Collections were created and are thus often organized with colonial people and future and history in mind. So Indigenous voices are present, but often buried or mislabeled within these larger collections. Slide, please. So what we want to emphasize is that the creation and the growth of tribal archives addresses these issues directly by collections that are readily accessible to tribal citizens, organized in a way that centers Indigenous voices and perspectives. And the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican Tribal Archive, which is housed within the Arvid E. Miller Library Museum, is this vast collection made up of both copies of materials that were meticulously located and copied from dozens of different archives over the last 90 years, such as these copies of Quinney's speeches, as well as materials that were created by the tribe, like the papers of the Historical Committee. So certainly tribal archives like this one make that material simply more accessible, but they also place these long separated materials in the context of other like items. So Quinney's items that were, previously at many different archival locations can now be accessed together. And those papers can be accessed with these Historical Committee meeting minutes and other papers that reference Quinney in the 20th century. So we can kind of see the trajectory of both his history as a leader and also how and why he's important to the community today. Together, all of these materials are then readily accessible to support this repatriation case. So in that sense, tribal archives are activist endeavors in that they both oppose the legacies of colonial collecting that archive Native knowledge and history within the context of settler history, and they're activist in that they enable and support various contemporary forms of activism like repatriation. I'm running out of time, so I don't have a ton of time to talk about the history of the Mohican Tribal Archive, but we'll just say that it has a very long history that extends beyond the arrival of Europeans on Turtle Island. Lisa Brooks, one of our keynote speakers, writes about this in her book, The Common Pot, about the Mohican Nation's long succession of recorders and rememberers who were charged with documenting and passing on the tribe's history. And so this work is really a continuation of that. And really the work of starting to copy these materials and really build the Mohican Tribal Archive officially sort of started in the 1930s. The papers of Quinney were probably copied in about the 1970s. And I believe I have a slide on that. So next slide, please. Thank you. And copying and assembling these materials in this new format allows the tribe to do things like reorganize these scattered materials, add tribal knowledge like family trees to different collections, and ultimately facilitate the production of new histories that center Mohican voices and perspectives. So this new collection allows them to work on things like curriculum and museum exhibits and things like this repatriation. So I will pass it back to Heather now to finish us off. Thanks.
I'll just finish up really quick. So if we go to the next slide. So the repatriation of the powder horn is no different. We're using the archives here and that are available to us to help bring this item home, and the willingness of the Oshkosh Public Museum to accept our argument that this is an item of cultural patrimony really sets a huge precedent for us to be able to bring items home in the future. And it just also goes to show the importance of not just John Quinney, but the importance of how he is viewed in our archives, and how we are able to portray that and make sure that in the future, when we are going to bring items home, that these archives are available to us. And I think there was one more slide, so you can just go to that slide really fast. And we're really excited, and I actually just got word this morning that the item has been posted on the Federal Registry. So just in about 30 days, we'll be able to bring this item home, which is really exciting. And again, because of the use of archives, we were able to prove that the item did fall within cultural patrimony and its significance to the Stockbridge-Munsee community. And again, it sets a huge precedent for the future. And with that, I will say Aaniiih-Gros Onewe, thank you. And thanks. We'll answer any questions that you have.
Wonderful, thank you. It's been so great to benefit from the experiences of my co-presenters here. Thanks to the American Philosophical Society for hosting this panel for including on it. And I'm speaking today from Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people. It's short, so let's move along. First slide, please. So just by way of introduction on what Alan already said to you about me, I'm a clinical community psychologist by training. I had this interesting academic crossroads back almost 30 years ago because I got graduate school. I couldn't make up my mind into psychiatry, psychology, or cultural anthropology. I went ahead and went into psychology, of course, and for 16 years at the University of Michigan in the psych department. Now I'm in an anthro department in a medical school. So apparently what goes around comes around. I'm working today on a very unusual project. In an Aaniiih archive, which is a story about Groban, story about Belknap. You see our tribal symbol here on the right. And also a family legacy, as I'll expand just a little bit about in the time we have here today, and to talk to you essentially about an edited collection I'm developing on the basis of these materials. Next slide, please. So way up here, overview, let me tell you a little bit more about Groban people, both pre-reservation and the reservation era all the way to today. In terms of our pre-reservation life, we're part of a larger Proto-Arapaho group that's split off to northern and southern Arapaho. There were some other peoples too that eventually folded in. Okay, I'm going to, I wonder, oh, slow down. Okay, I also wonder if you could turn off my video. Would that work? Because I do worry about bandwidth sometimes here. I'm sorry to say. In any case, thank you. As long as they'll turn me, this should be okay. Sorry about that. So, we're a member of the speaking language family. We are also longly allied with the Black Confederacy. And our place on northern Maine was originally Saskatchewan, later in Montana, but that part of the world was really a cauldron of violence due to the destabilization of the fur trade from much of report history. And so war was really a dominant influence on our lives throughout all of the past couple centuries. We were settled on the Fort Belknap Reservation in 1888, and as the anthropologist Loretta Fowler, there's been long-standing criticism of Aaniiih-Gros cultural ideals beyond that period of war prior to the reservation era to the reservation era. She characterized these talking with a lot of people in my grandparents' generation, the persistence of tenacity, velocity of the pursuit of primacy relative to other peoples, even as Provence as a civilization strategy adapted a so-called progressive approach. Provence today, roughly 4,000 citizens. We share the Fort Belknap Reservation who we allied with in the latter part of the 19th century. And they're really important reservation institutions like private college and public school and service stuff that's pretty usual. Next slide. Thank you. Briefly about my grandfather, Frederick Peter Gron. Frederick Gron was born in 1886. His name is Plumes. He experienced a name change when he was put to the federal government boarding school at Fort Belknap in 1885. There, because of the practices of the school, he basically was changed from his own Indian name to the surname that came from his father, our family name is gone as a result. Then his early family life was such that he recognized kids were an adolescent, and during that time period, looked to have a family, looked to have a place to live. There was desperate poverty on the reservation, so really had a tough time during those early years. He ended up doing, for employment purposes, what the Montana Writers Project. The Montana Writers Project was a UPA-funded initiative in the state of Montana. It was hiring folklorists and operators from around the state, including reservation field workers. So my grandfather was employed by the Montana Writers Project on the reservation to be the field worker with our people of the roads. He and his generation were able of English speakers, probably the only generation that's been completely fluent in ways in our and among the different reservation field workers, so the reservation one is public in terms of ratings. Next slide, please. So his collection during his employment with the Montana Writers Project was part of the Indian volume by the Writers Project that would be published based on material crafted by these workers. He was paid by the word, so his job was all around and trying to gather local or unquote, which taught the old people developed legend and history and such things. He developed in his year and a half with the Montana Writers Project contributions, 700 pages in longhand. These include these of at the time, true tales that people were still recounting, callbacks of various kinds, myths, and sketch some things out. So he contributed quite a lot. Right here, an example of one of his sketches is a famous cheese on and Bullwatch. His crowning achievement in this collection was Bullwatch's life. Basically, this around the beginning of the 19th century, died in 1884. And he got the sound. I'm not sure. Let me try to move this a bit. Yeah, okay. Just to move forward, I'm sorry about the sound issues and what I can do about it. And perhaps this will help, but perhaps not. I'm just going to continue as time is so I can do the best here. Let me say that Montana Writers Project ended abruptly at the beginning of World War II in 1941, and so my great grandfather. Interestingly, what happened was these writings were apparently in a city dump in Newberry, the headquarters project was, and happened to notice them, seeing them, so they could end up in the archives of the Montana State University. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. So Bullwatch's life is one because that's pretty widely known. I wanted to briefly put another instance. This is just to give you an example of the kinds of things that are in this collection. He wrote this event party December 1941. It's interesting because my very first research project as a master's student, I interviewed my own elders to understand more about rural cultural identity. Part of that project was to inquire about stories that would happen in the city of and a number of elders talked about redwood in particular about. So redwood's tale is well known on the reservation, and it's long celebrated, it's important. So it's really tells us inspired redwood and his inseparable friend was killed in battle but for whom redwood exhibited amazing behavior. My grandfather's informant, as he described him, named Rufus Warrior, this is 1,600 years long, and it's been informally written ever since. For example, our Florida Education Department published a lot of these war stories in 1982, but never formally published in some of these texts. So in terms of the local era that Peter's interview with my uncle William Degon, the introduction that I'm writing in some ways, this contribution to this panel is the beginning of that. Clear text of this photos and illustrations, of which there are 17. This material here. Notes that my great-grandfather, while he was preparing the story from talking with people. Original essays by the American Indigenous Studies scholars, 2 reprints, and editorial blog. Next slide, please. This one I found out, I think that the real collection will make comprehensively available all of his writing, which hasn't been done before. It will be packaged really for a broad range of audiences that will afford tribal public and scholarly access to his writings. Third, it will jumpstart scholarship. Not written about his writings, even though, as you see on the right, the 7 Visions of Bull was amended and published back in 1980. So, I think it's a pretty important to finally also a familial lineage about Indigenous knowledge, particularly that knowledge shaped practices of morality to those of literacy, which could stand to a lot more interrogations around what that might mean. With that, last slide, please. I'll just know that a lot of the stuff that I think I write about can be found on my website here. And I'm so far out of time, but I look for hopefully to some responses. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, we have to apologize for that technical difficulties there. Well, as we know, we're in a different situation here where we have many people using the internet now, and different people have different bandwidth and different issues. But as you see in the chat, we actually have, they posted a link to Joseph's paper. So I would actually urge you to read all 3 of the papers. It's a good suite of papers to contemplate the utility of archives in this era of self-determination and cultural revitalization. So to begin to set us off, I'd like to say, as an Anishinaabe person, I thank each of you for these papers. I really enjoyed them. It is an exciting time for Indigenous people who are reclaiming so much of their cultural property, their history, their land, their culture, and their language. I'm reminded of the prophecy of our spiritual leader, Badwewadung, which he had written down. He said that there would come a time when young people would retrace the steps of their ancestors to pick up the items that were left along the trail. I understand that to mean more than physical items like the powder horn, but he also meant songs and stories, medicine, and governance and social structures. I see that in each of your papers, but it's not enough to just gather everything together. You have to activate it. The late Dan Pine, a revered Ojibwe elder from Garden River, Ontario, used to say that, quote, "It is time to wake up the medicines," end quote. So in waking up the medicines that you have gathered, panelists, there are many issues to consider, especially ownership, control, access, and possession. In fact, in Canada, there is a framework document called the OCAP, Ownership, Control, Access, and Possession. It was developed in reaction to research conducted in First Nation and tribal communities. The document very strongly states that information produced about their communities should be owned, controlled, and possessed by themselves. I see in each of your papers, to a degree, you have endeavored to identify where these buried documents are in order to assemble them in one repository in tribal homelands. Has there been any talk in repatriating certain sensitive documents from other repositories yet? Further, many recognize that writing, especially in this digital age, can traverse great distances to countless people, in terms of which cultural knowledge to be shared and what shouldn't be shared. How do you propose to exert control? So I pose that to the panel. How do you propose to exert control and access to your cultural knowledge, especially ones that are sensitive? Rose, Heather, Joseph, is anybody picking their answer here?
I'll give it a stab. So I think when it comes to items of cultural sensitivity, we need to make sure that those who are coming to our facilities to inquire about such items, you know, what are they being used for? What are you wanting to know? Because I think one of the things that we take into consideration is protection, and so many things have been taken that we want to make sure that, you know, when you're using documents or items, or you're wanting to see items that are culturally sensitive or in some cases sacred, it's kind of, we want to make sure that they're being protected and that they're not being used for exploitation of any type, I think. And so I think just questioning those, particularly non-native researchers coming in, just, you know, you might feel like we're putting you through the third degree, but we're kind of just wanting to make sure that, you know, these items are going to be used in a way that honors the ancestors and honors the community that they're in.
Okay, thank you. That question, I had actually asked that question, but I see in the chat here, Katie Childs or Chiles has also asked that as well, but more pointedly, she asked for Heather and Rose, has there been any talk of trying to repatriate Hendrik Oppermann's 1792 manuscript from the Historical Society of Pennsylvania? And or could you speak on the role specifically of Stockbridge-Munsee women? She noticed that in the photographs featured in your PowerPoint, that there were many women at the tables.
Yeah, so there hasn't been any talk of repatriating that particular document. Unfortunately, NAGPRA does not pertain to the repatriation of documents, only objects of cultural significance and human remains. So in order for a document to be brought back to the community, we need to approach them in a different way, because there are several documents out east that we would love to have in our facility to bring back home that are pertinent to our people. And I'll let Rose speak to the role of women in those photos.
Yeah, absolutely. You definitely picked up on something there. It is mostly women that have done this work, particularly since the Historical Committee was formed in the early 1970s, late 1960s. And what we see in that moment is actually quite a shift in the historic recorder or rememberer role that Lisa Brooks talks about. And that I talked about a little bit. Historically, that's always been recorded as a male role, but when the Historical Committee is formed, it's really women that come together to bring these documents together and to create this tribal archive. And they're really the ones who are writing the grants, raising money, going to all these different archives and copying these materials. And, you know, in talking to people about this over the years, I think that Molly Miller has really explained this the best to me. Molly is one of the elders in the community, and there's a really wonderful video of her talking about the role of women within Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican communities on the Ways website, which is a website about Wisconsin history, Native history and culture. And in that video, Molly talks about how women are really responsible as caretakers of their community. And she specifically positions her role as a caretaker as taking care of the language and taking care of the history and teaching that language and history to future generations of Stockbridge-Munsee people. And so I really think about these women sort of stepping into that traditional role as caretakers and interpreting that role as needing to care for this history and to pass it on to future generations so that it can be used for cultural revitalization, language revitalization, repatriation, creating new educational materials. And Alan, I love the question about, you know, sort of activating these materials. What do we do after these materials are gathered? Because I think that's so present when you read the historical materials around the formation of the committee, the formation of the R.B.D. Miller Library Museum. Dorothy Davids, who's one of the co-founders, actually calls the library museum in one of her writings the place where the action is, which I think just, you know, perfectly encompasses exactly what the purpose of gathering all these materials from all these different places was to really just arm the tribe with the ability to activate and make all of these different interventions. So,
Megan, do you have anything to add?
Well, so we're actually about to open our brand new Choctaw Cultural Center. And so now we finally have a place for kind of items. I know we've been like held back because of COVID so many times, but we're hoping to, like, we're still in the process of getting everything together and like there are so many things all over the place. And so we're just kind of in the beginning processes of like, where are everything kind of, and getting that kind of together before bringing things home. Yeah.
Okay, so you're not necessarily looking at repatriating many of the Choctaw documents at this point, but there is a question on the chat here, and they asked if you could talk more about the importance of intergenerational work in the archive and the community.
Yeah, so there are so many community members who have all of these kinds of histories and stories, and I grew up with them, and it's never in the archival kind of record, and it's kind of actually why I do anthropology, is because I just wanted to hang out with community members and document and kind of collect those things. But people didn't they didn't think it was like real or as important, or they didn't see its kind of significance. And I think working with archival material was like, here, it's like this thing happened, and these are the materials that kind of tell you about their significance a little bit more. So it kind of helps community members be like, oh, these stories that I used to tell, they're more significant to a wider historical kind of narrative than I kind of thought, because I just thought it was just an everyday kind of thing. And so for them, it helps them kind of see that. And so I like to bring documents with me when I like talk with people, and be like, hey, look at kind of all these things going on.
Right. So when I mentioned that about the activating the knowledge, when I read Joseph's paper, he literally said that one of the the actual manuscript had been saved from a dumpster of his grandfather's manuscript. So it was actually it was almost destined for the dump, but he was able to pull it out and retrieve it. And one of the things, I guess, one of the questions would be looking at how the tension between orality and literacy, and looking at how a lot of our Native communities, Indigenous communities, value that orality, but yet there's a tension in that much of the work that scholars and academics do is actually based in literacy. And then looking at Joseph's work with his grandfather's manuscript, and then making that more available, the history as told by his grandfather's old people, and bringing that to the present, looking at what kind of issues there, if Joseph's able to answer this, of looking at what should have been, were you, as an editor, did you feel that you have to actually exclude any of those stories? And if you felt you had the reason to exclude some of those stories, what were the reasons?
Thank you, Alan. I will hazard an attempt to respond. We'll see if anyone can hear. If it's breaking up so badly you can't hear, just wave your hand and I'll stop. But I will try. Okay, good. Thank you. So I really do think about this collection and about Indigenous knowledge protection and preservation with respect to orality and literacy, because I think these are really different modalities that Walter Ong originally theorized decades ago now, require really different modes of thought. And we don't want to be essentializing about it. We want to recognize that tribal communities and other communities can adopt these different modalities and become fluid and fluent in both of them. Even as literacy, of course, lends itself to a kind of a distancing, as Ong would say, a distancing of ideas, a distancing of what you get in the oral tradition. It becomes fixed in ways that can carry across time. So my great-grandfather was quite interested in preserving, protecting. As he writes about these things, he says a lot about the importance of documenting these things so a broader public who doesn't know Fort Belknap, who wouldn't know any Gros people, could learn some things about us in a way that might engender more respect than we felt at that time. But of course, there's a bargain that you strike when you do that, which is that you fix knowledge in a way that was never fixed in an oral tradition, of course, because once it's there, it's gone, and you have whatever you take from it, and you can retell it or make sense of it or whatever. But there's no going back to say, well, what exactly was said? I mean, you can debate. Literacy leads to kind of debate around words and ideas in a way that orality didn't quite have in that same sense. So my grandfather was trying to preserve, but once you do that, then that knowledge is no longer your own. It gets out, and it can travel far beyond anything you ever intend or attempt. Interestingly, he was paid by the Works Projects Administration funded Montana Writers Project. So these are no longer his or even Grovon words. These belong to the people of the United States. And so, this stuff is in the Montana State University archives. It was all preserved there, and anyone can access it and read it. So there's really no way now, if we wanted even to get the genie back in the bottle, so to speak, around including some of this knowledge. It's not ours anymore in that sense to even seclude. So these are some of the interesting complications around an archive like this that I'm hoping that publishing these collected writings can open up for scholars in Native American Indigenous Studies to kind of debate and dialogue and explore further.
Okay, we're approaching our conclusion here, but I wanted to just pose, I guess, go further on that vein between orality and literacy. I had recently reread Robert Warrior's chapter called Intellectual History and Indigenous Methodology in a book edited by Gene O'Brien. So he says, Indigenous writing under the sign of modernity is an aporia, an act of Indigenous agency that seems to pave the inroads of colonization, even if and when its intent is to resist their encroachment. From the 17th century to the 21st century, proliferation of Native American and First Nations intellectuals writing in every form imaginable, and increasingly in Indigenous languages, the technology of Western writing has marked a separation, or at least the threat of it, between Indigenous people and their communities. I guess based on your experience working with archives and recording, recovering what has been written down by Quinny or your Choctaw ancestors, or even your great-grandfather, Joseph, would any of you like to talk about what Warrior's assertion is, that it is paving the inroads to colonization?
I'll just respond very briefly since I just talked, which is to say that it feels to me like colonization had plenty of inroads before a project like my great-grandfather's. In fact, I think a lot of what he was up to was trying to write against colonization in a way that could reach a broader audience of people who, were completely expected we were dead, vanished, or what have you. So I just think there's also potential to counteract some of those tendencies through writing itself.
I think I could piggyback on that.
Okay.
Oh, I was just going to say,
ahead.
I think I could piggyback on that when you see some of Quinny's writings. Because the Mohicans were colonized and Christianized so early on. I mean, we met Henry Hudson. We found him off of our shores. And so you see that in Quinny's writings, particularly in his 4th of July speech, where he is, we have, he's, educated in a Eurocentric education. He's using that to push back. So you see that in a lot of his writings coming up, particularly that 4th of July speech, where he's saying, what is 4th of July to the American Indian, So I think definitely even being educated in that Eurocentric manner, you see it being used to push back against colonization.
And I think too, looking at, how tribal archives are often organized, it allows some of these oral sources to exist alongside these written sources, which is part of what I really love about the way that the Mohican Tribal Archive is organized. You can access Quinny's papers, and you can also access, contemporary elders, talking about Quinny and having their own reflections on this history, which I think is so crucial. Something that Megan mentioned in her presentation about really the importance of having community voices to respond to these archival documents. And just to add one more layer to that, I think, one of the best examples that I've seen of this is one of the early tribal members who was working to copy some of these materials from different archives was Arvid Miller, and who the Library Museum is now named for. And in many cases, he is just copying by hand these, land deeds or treaties or various materials. But in other cases, he's actually taking different sections of different documents and stitching them together into his own new narrative. So he's actually taking these various written sources and then rewriting his own version of that history, which I just think is such a wonderful example of how archival materials can be reimagined by Indigenous writers. And then those stories are placed in the archive for future generations. So I think it's really important to remember kind of how writing, as Joseph said, can be used to speak back in a way.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that's something that our research group really does, because every single one of them is like, they're kind of a historian in their own right with their own expertises, and they know so much. Like, we have genealogists who can go way back and like know people's family. You say one name and it's like they know everything. And so when we kind of come together, we're collectively going through these materials and reading them. It's like, okay, so there's all of these stuff going on, and what are the things that we know that we have to consider when we kind of retell the history, back to how would we kind of present it, and what we know about particular kinds of communities. And it's a kind of collective endeavor to re-narrate our history in our own way. And so that's really what our group kind of does, in addition to just going to archives.
Right. I actually wanted to ask you a bit more, Megan, about the use of the Choctaw archives, especially when you're not necessarily in land claim, but actually looking at governance and self-determination, and how you are using those early documents that your Choctaw ancestors had written down to actually glean and sift through elements of how you would enact modern day self-government that's based upon what is in those archives, especially in the Choctaw language.
I guess I can answer. Yeah, so we're still kind of working on translating and collecting and figuring out things, but it's really helped to like follow the laws and like figure out how our ancestors understood the laws and how they kind of push legislation or whatnot, and kind of read into those in new different kinds of ways. And so it's like, oh, our ancestors were trying to do this, and so this is the kind of historical trajectory. And then we kind of pass that along to our leadership and be like, hey, so this is the kind of history, and these are the kinds of motivations, and we should think about that as we make decisions about Oklahoma or Choctaw Nation today.
Okay. I believe now our time is up, and I'm gonna the book by I was asked to put in. I'll answer in the chat, the Q&A, about the reference to Gene O'Brien's book, Sources, Methods, and Indigenous Studies. I'll type that out in the chat, but I guess I have to take the time to thank the American Philosophical Society for inviting me to be the moderator of this panel, and also to thank all of you for the work that you are doing. It was a pleasure to read those papers, and I encourage all the attendees online to actually download the papers and then also to read them and then follow up. I imagine that you're able to follow up with each of these people and to ask your questions directly to them, because it isn't possible to get through all of these questions, and there are some excellent questions on the Q&A. So I'll turn it over to Kyle Roberts.
Thanks, Alan. Sorry to jump in so soon. The panel was so great, I wanted to be part of the action. So thanks, Megan. Thanks, Rose, Heather, and Joe. Thanks for your putting up with our technical difficulties in Joe's paper. So Joe, we'll reach out, and we have our post-production phase, and we'll ask you maybe to re-record so that in the final video, we have all the richness of your presentation. For questions that we didn't get to, as Alan was just saying, we're going to share them with the participants, and we'll post them on our website afterwards. So thank you, everyone, for what you've offered there. Our next panel is at 3 p.m., so you got about 50 minutes to stretch your legs, get a glass of water, and get ready for a panel on engaging digital archives to meet Indigenous community priorities. But first, please join me in thanking so much our panelists and our moderator for a wonderful presentation. Thanks, everyone.